Okay, every street that runs off Somerville Street?
Yes.
Telephone number you're calling from?
454
Mm-hmm.
2527.
454
2527.
2527. And your last name?
Bain.
Bain. Okay, we're on our way. Okay, Mr. Bain? Yeah, we'll be there very shortly.
Okay. So this is a very complicated case. In a minute there will be coming up a reference where you can read about the legal background of it, which I'm not going to go into today. Pardon? Thank you. Yeah, in a minute a reference will come to the legal case so that you can read about it if you want to. What happened was that shortly after making that phone call, just a few days later, he was accused that he himself was the murderer. This went through a lot of legal cases, and it was under appeal many years later, and they were getting the audio out again to play again in court, and a detective noticed that in the call itself there is a confession by the young man that he was the murderer. Did you notice the confession? Nobody else had ever noticed it before, but I've just picked out the segment here. You might be able to listen.
Okay, every street that runs off Somerville Street?
Yes.
Telephone number you're calling from?
454.
Now, did you hear the confession? Okay, but the detective did. He heard these words, "I shot the prick." I'll play it again, listen. At this point, most people say, I hear it. Okay? Of course, the interesting thing is, no, he didn't say, "I shot the prick." It's difficult to be sure exactly what he said. I think, personally, my best guess is that he said, "I can't breathe," but a lot of people believe that he was just breathing very heavily and not even speaking. So I think I have it here one more time for you to listen to. Who thinks he said, "I shot the prick"? Who thinks he said, "I can't breathe"? Who's got no idea what he said? Okay, so in New Zealand, originally it was 1994 was the crime, but this last appeal finally went through, I think it was 2009 or 10, like 4 or 5 years ago. There was heaps of legal argument. Both sides got phonetics experts in. Phonetics experts on both sides agreed that he didn't say, "I shot the prick." Unfortunately, they all tried to say what they thought he did say, instead of just saying, "We can't tell what he said," which would be, in my opinion, would be better. They all said something different, so that made it look a bit dodgy to the lawyers. They argued for a long time and finally decided to exclude that from the... this is the reference that I meant if you ever want to look it up. And they excluded the audio. It was not used in the case. Also, David Bain was finally found not guilty and released from prison after 14 years, and he's now on the circuit of people who've been wrongfully imprisoned. Now, I have to say that this audio, in fact, didn't play a role in that because it was excluded after the legal evidence. However, it could have played a role. And in fact, we can see how much of a role it could have played because after the trial, it was released to the media and it was played. You can go to YouTube now and listen to the whole thing. And many, many people in New Zealand say, we told you he was guilty. It's plain as day that he says, "I shot the prick." So I'm fairly confident that if it had been played in court, it could well have influenced the jury. Anyway, here's me trying to make these arguments to the legal system, blah, 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 you shouldn't leave it up to the jury. And I thought, this is perfect. I'll do an experiment using this audio and show how it affects people. Okay, so very quickly, we had 190 participants. It was online. People listened to the audio very much as you've just done. they could listen as many times as they wanted to the whole call or to just the short segment. We took them through 7 evidence points. So you just had 2 or 3 evidence points where I said it's a murder, and then I said it was a confession, and then I provided a transcript. And then in your case, I provided an alternative. In the experiment, we didn't provide an alternative. We didn't say, he said, I can't breathe. But we had 7 evidence points similar to that. But we had 2 groups, and the evidence that we gave was slightly different for the 2 groups, but the audio was the same for both of them. Okay? So, the main thing is that we can say that the transcript primes perception of I shot the prick. By primes, I mean once you've seen that suggestion, you're much more likely to hear that. So on this graph, normally I like to point to it, but it's far too far away, but hopefully that pink arrow shows you something. You can see the evidence points going along the bottom from left to right, 1 to 7. In the first 3 evidence points, that was where we were telling them things about the murder and the confession and the shooting and what have you. Nobody in either group heard anything like I shot the prick. At evidence point 4 is where we showed group A that particular transcript, and you can see that over a third of them confidently heard I shot the prick at that point. Then we went through several more evidence points, really trying to persuade them that he didn't say I shot the prick. But you'll notice it never goes back down to 0 again. There's still, even at the end of the experiment, there's still a percentage of people who stick to the belief that he said, I shot the prick. And this is particularly significant at evidence point 7, which is the last evidence point, because at that point we told them the whole story, essentially what I've just told you, that he was accused of the murder and he was wrongfully imprisoned and then released, that we now know he didn't commit the murder, and also that experts agreed that he didn't say, I shot the prick. Basically just telling them the story. And telling them that we've done an experiment with 2 groups to demonstrate how easy it is to prime people with an inaccurate transcript. Even having heard that many people, however many percentage, I think it was about 15%, still believed that he said, I shot the prick. And perhaps even more interestingly, if you look at group B, who were getting a different transcript throughout, they were hearing something about somebody else being the murderer. At the very end, at evidence point 7, when they are just told that whole story and just hear the phrase, I shot the prick for the first time, then nearly the same number, in fact, that's not statistically different at the end. They all say, yes, I shot the prick, that's what it is. So it's very unlikely that people are really listening independently at that point. We also found a strong correlation with opinions as to whether the speaker was guilty if they heard I shot the prick. I won't go into this, but it's important to point out that it wasn't just the 30% who accepted the prime that were affected. Even people who did not accept the prime, even if they said, I do not believe he said I shot the prick, we could show that they were affected by having heard that in their perception of other words. I won't go into that now. The reference is there in case you should want to look it up. So what was the response from the lawyers? I've spoken about it in quite a few places to lawyers, and they all say, it's fascinating. They're really interested in the way their ears can play tricks on them. But no, there's no need to reform the legal process, because after all, an expert was called. In this case, several experts were called, and the right thing was done. It was excluded. They say it's really up to the defense to stop bad transcripts going to the jury. We don't need to change the law. However, I was very concerned by this stage because at this time I'd now had many, many examples of very inaccurate transcripts being admitted without challenge from not being stopped by the defense and clearly influencing the outcome of the case. So at this point, another case came my way, and I took the opportunity to do another experiment. This case involved, I think I shot the prick at least it has the virtue that it is quite plausible. You can sort of see how somebody would hear, "I shot the prick," even though we might agree that he didn't, in fact, say that. This case that I'm about to tell you, which in fact was the one I played you right at the beginning, it's actually an implausible transcript. Nevertheless, it was not challenged by the defense, and it was played to the jury, and in fact it's clear from the trial transcripts that it played a strong role in leading to a conviction for murder, and the speaker is currently serving a 30-year prison sentence. There is an attempt to reopen his case. We don't know if that will be successful. Okay, so in this case, the audio, I will play it for you again. It's the one where I said it's 14 seconds from 38 minutes. It's two men discussing a pact or an agreement to commit a murder. And the issue of the trial was, is it a pact to commit the murder? In other words, are they accessories before the fact, as the law, as our legal system calls it? Are they plotting to commit a murder? Or is it just a pact to conceal the murder? And then he's an accessory after the fact, which is a much lesser crime. So with context and without too much interference from the rain, you might be able to hear the phrase, "At the start, we made a pact." Did anybody hear it? It's not there to be heard, so please don't say yes. It's not about a pact. Another alternative could be, excuse me for swearing, it's fucking payback. That's supposed to be at the start we made a pact. I think it's completely implausible. I can't even see how somebody would ever have thought that it meant that, except in 38 minutes it goes by so quickly that if you see it, and also at the beginning of the trial, you don't know which parts are going to be picked out as key phrases. So it was just in the whole transcript was inaccurate throughout. This was just one of many inaccurate bits, so you can see why they might not have picked up on it. So first we did some phonetic analysis to demonstrate that he didn't say, "At the start we made a pact." And then we did this other experiment. It had two parts. Can you still hear me? Do I need to speak louder? This has got two parts. So in condition one, the participants hear the audio with no context. I think we did tell them it was a murder, but that was all. They just had to listen as you did the first time. And we counted lots of different things. Again, I'm simplifying just to pick out one or two important things. At the beginning, we counted how many people thought he said, "At the start we made a pact." At the beginning, nobody thought he said that. In fact, nobody who's heard that audio has ever thought he said anything remotely like that, because it's completely implausible. However, when we suggested the transcript, some people said, "Okay, yeah, sure, he may have said at the start we made a pact." I think it was 27%. This is a lower priming than for the other phrases, but there is a priming effect. But what is really interesting here is when we give them the alternative, it's fucking payback, everybody abandons that one and says, "Oh no, it's not we made at the start we made a pact. I hear it now, it's fucking payback." Okay, so that is very unusual. Compare that with "I shot the prick," where they clung to their interpretation. So this is all evidence that in itself that transcription is very implausible. That's how I should have done it. Now, in condition 2, we did it completely differently. We gave them a long story at the beginning, giving the context of the murder, similar to what I've just told you, but with more detail, much more graphic detail about the family, that the father plotted with the son to murder the grandfather. It's a very dramatic story. And then we played them the audio. Now, we don't actually suggest at the start we made a pact, but we've given them all this story about a pact. We use the word pact over and over again. now we play them the audio with no transcript, and amazingly, this time over a third of them hear the word pact. Still nobody hears at the start we made a pact. They make up all kinds of other phrases. In fact, some of them said, well, I heard the word pact, but I didn't hear much else. But they're fairly confident they did hear the word pact. Look what happens when we suggest the phrase, at the start we made a pact, with the context. 74% hear the word pact, including 65% who hear that exact phrase. And then, again, we go through this whole sort of debriefing thing, saying, no, it wasn't that, it's fucking payback. Now we've got 19% retaining that exact phrase, at the start we made a pact, rather than abandoning for it's fucking payback. Okay, are you with me? Is that all clear? The most important thing was the strong effect of the audio on opinions about guilt, the story about the father, even for those who reject the suggested transcript. So one of the arguments we want to make here is you shouldn't be giving these transcripts in the first place. For one thing, they'll be influencing a lot of people directly, and even those that they don't influence directly, it will be influencing them indirectly. So in this case, even those who rejected it, I don't know if you can see that graph clearly. At the beginning, we asked them who has an opinion about the guilt of the father. 80% said they had no opinion. Interesting that 20% had an opinion, having just been told there was a murder of a grandfather, and the father and the son were suspects. After having heard the audio and gone through all this sort of thing, only 40% say they have no opinion. Okay, and this is divided between those who accept and reject our transcript. Another thing that's important is these participants listened many times to a very short piece of audio under many conditions that could be expected to make them very skeptical or disbelieving of our transcript. All participants spent at least 10 minutes, and many spent much more than 10 minutes, but at least 10 minutes listening to 14 seconds, which would make it over 20 hours to listen to the entire 38 minutes. It's completely unrealistic to expect a jury to do that amount of work. And finally, even after listening that many times, the participants came to many different conclusions as to what was heard. There were nearly as many different conclusions as there were participants. So it's not the case, as is said in Australia with the police, or they listen many times and then they're more likely to be right. You can listen many times and be wrong every time. Okay, I think I'll run quickly through these last bits, which are just kind of commentary from me, given that we're running a bit late. The main thing is the law needs phonetics. Like I said at the beginning, a lot of people think phonetics is just adding some complicated symbols and things to what everybody already knows, but that's not the case. It would be better if the law had developed in collaboration with phoneticians rather than doing it separately and saying, oh, we'll call on you when we need you. I don't know if this is a useful analogy. I'll try it. You can tell me if you think it's useful or not. You may have heard of these famous experiments that go back to the 1970s from Elizabeth Loftus, very famous in showing how unreliable eyewitnesses can be, even when they're very confident. And one of her most famous experiments was people saw a video of two cars crashing. And then after some time, they were asked to remember what they'd seen in the video. But they were asked in different ways. So some of them were asked, how fast was the car going when it bumped the other car? And some were asked, how fast was the car going when it crashed into the other car? And the estimates are much higher in speed when they hear the word crashed. And also, they were then asked, did you see any broken glass? If they had suggested that it was crashed rather than bumped, people thought they'd seen broken glass, were much more likely to think they'd seen broken glass, even though there was no broken glass in the video. I think in a way a transcript affects us in the same way. It's giving somebody else's interpretation. We've had some really good descriptions earlier today about how interpreting audio is a first level of interpretation of the evidence. Even just in stating what words you hear, you are already making an interpretation, even before you start deciding what do these words mean or what's the implication in the context. And it seems to me that seeing a transcript is almost like hearing a slightly biased eyewitness account. If you see a transcript with the word crash in it, you'll hear the word crash just as much as if you hear somebody discussing it in relation to a crash. I don't know if that is useful or not. That's probably all more related to the Australian context. The key thing that we have to notice from all of this is how easy it is to be wrong in making a transcript when you're involved in the case. It's much better to have somebody independent of the case making the transcript, even if that means they can transcribe less, because what they can transcribe is less likely to be biased. Most importantly, we can't expect people to disregard the transcript, just use the transcript as an aid, come to your own opinion. It's very easy to let a transcript influence you without you having any awareness that it's influencing you. You can confidently and strongly believe, I am not being biased, I'm not being influenced, but these operate below the level of consciousness and they're not subject to an effort of will. You can't decide not to be influenced. I had a nice quote that I forgot to put in here by Bill Thompson in the US, a famous forensic psychologist there, to show the same thing. And Laura mentioned earlier there was this interesting case with Oscar Pistorius's words. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about this case. So this is a very short transcript, a very short section from his testimony when he broke down and cried. It was in the news worldwide. Would you like to listen to it? There's the transcript to assist you.
And I sat over Riva and I cried. And I don't know how long. I don't know how long I was there for. She wasn't breathing.
That's what I think he says. However, newspapers around the world quoted, presumably somebody transcribed it, she wasn't breathing, not she was everything. Would you like to listen again?
She wasn't breathing.
Who thinks she said? Who thinks he said she was everything? Who thinks he said? I can't even speak my own language. Who thinks he said she wasn't breathing? Quite a few. Yeah, okay. I'm fairly confident he says she wasn't breathing, partly because looking at the spectrogram and doing the audio analysis. Also, after I published this on my blog, somebody emailed me and said if he did say that, it would be absolutely extraordinary, because his whole case was when he reached Riva, she was still alive, and he carried her downstairs and tried to resuscitate her. I don't think he would say she wasn't breathing if he wanted everybody to believe she was still alive. I don't know. Anyway, there we are. You can have your own opinion, but my opinion's right. So what should we do about this? I think one reason that the legal system resists phoneticians coming along and say you should leave it up to experts, they think this is going to be very expensive. We can't have experts analysing everything. And also they believe that the evidence in these covert recordings is very powerful. And it really is. It's very easy for someone like me to come along and pick up one or two mistakes, but these things are used a lot, and they do have very good results in solving crimes that I personally want solved. Okay, I don't want some poor person locked up for a murder he didn't commit, but I do want them to use this kind of thing to catch real bad people. I think the best suggestion that I can make is to distinguish very carefully between investigative uses of covert recordings and evidentiary uses. So by investigative, I mean the police, or whoever it is, it doesn't have to be the police, can listen to the audio and decide what it says and use the information as part of their investigation. So for example, if they hear somebody saying, let's get our guns and go to such and such an address and have a hold-up, the police can go to that address, and if they were right in hearing that, then they'll be able to catch them. Excellent. That's perfectly fine. And we've already heard before some good discussions of how, in any case, the police are always the first to listen to these things, that the police have to listen to them. The question is, can their transcripts then be used as evidence in court? I